Okay, good morning, class. So we're going to start this discussion. It's going to be a brief one on Richard Wright. Talk about a little bit about his history. We'll read the poem. At least I'll read it out loud, and then we'll talk about some of the points that you all brought up and kind of like the general themes of the poem. Tie them together into kind of a sense of what the author was trying to get to. Okay, so of course the name of this poem is "Between the World and Me," and the author is Richard Wright. He was born in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, to be more accurate. And in his household, as he recalls from his memoir, that he was raised by very strict religious women in his life, whereas the men were largely absent or drunk, right? So he didn't have, um, or maybe even I think he calls them violent, right? Violent men in his life. So he had a pretty rough upbringing there in Jackson, Mississippi. Not only is he a black man being raised in the South, but this is during the time of um, before the civil rights movement um, has really gone into full swing. So being a free black man but with no actual insured rights made it very difficult for him. And so his parents were sharecroppers, right? So that meant that they um, grew produce, and the extra produce, which was almost all of it, they had to sell to the plantation owners at a cheap price, who would then sell the larger bulk of it at a higher rate. So when he was younger, at about age 6, his father left the house, leaving his mom to raise him by herself, and she had a difficult time of it. Of course, she was trying to work to ensure the family could feed themselves, and so she would leave her son with other family members and things like that to raise them. For the most part, the grandmother was in charge of taking care of him, but he didn't just go visit the grandma during the day, then come back, sort of like a daycare. He was left there to live with her for a good majority of his life, well, of the time, right? And then the mom would come occasionally to check in on him, which led to some incidents, to say the least. He, always being curious and a little rebellious, um, didn't listen as well as some might hope their children would, um, which is the nature of children for the most part. However, he accidentally set fire to his grandmother's home um, at a very young age, and it led to a terrible beating, one that he describes as only ending because he lost consciousness. Right, so he fell unconscious um, from the abuse, and the grandmother still held a grudge against him. So he would suffer beatings pretty often, at least until he was forced to leave the grandmother's house. And so he's still a young man, 7 to 8 years old, um, a boy really, and he's being pushed from home to home with aunts and uncles and things like that. Anybody who can take him in at the time and is willing to put up with him for as long as they can, again, because he was perhaps a bit stubborn and rebellious. Um, but that meant that all these people in his life would hit him, right, to try and correct him, um, and that really just pushed him away from his own family for the most part. Is why he calls himself agnostic, which, for those of you that don't know, um, agnostic is sort of like an atheist, where an atheist actively denies the um, um, the existence of a deity, divine being, or God figure. Agnostics just say they don't know if there's one that exists, and there's no way for them to really prove it. So they don't know, and they're not going to question. They're not going to seek an answer. Right? They're just going to live their lives. And so that's what agnosticism really is. It's more of a don't know, don't care philosophy as far as religion and divine beings. Um, but even so, he excelled in school after all this moving around and abuse he suffered. He was always a voracious reader. He just loved to read, and part of that translated to being a great writer. And so, when he was 15 and 16 years old, um, different articles would give you different dates. So it's really hard to tell which one it is. Um, he ended up publishing some work for his school, and it was fairly successful, even at a high school printing, right, about there, and it was spread around. So he developed a little bit of a claim for his ability to write. Um, However, by the time he was 17, it was time for him to leave the home. He just could not. His grandmother still did not ever want him around, and he didn't really have the support of the family there. So he moved to Chicago. And there in Chicago, Illinois, he had a friend who was white. And the only reason this is important is because at the time, in order to have a library card and to be able to check books out from the library, you had to be white. They would not loan books to people of color. And so his friend, who did have a library card, would let him use the library card, and then it was up um, to Richard to forge notes saying, on behalf of me, the white friend, I am asking so and so, Richard Wright, to procure these books for me and return them to me. And so he would turn in these forged notes over along with the library card to borrow these books, but they were never for anybody except himself. And then, of course, he would just read them. And so part of what he really started to read into is, of course, communism through the Communist Manifesto, also known as Marxism, right? And he's working at this time. He starts working at a publishing house because of his small success, but he continues to publish and be widely read. So he moves up fairly quickly within that publishing house, and those who he reads, right, that also want to be published, he tends to favor those who are also Marxist and or express atheism slash agnosticism. And so he kind of creates his pipeline um, through his own preferences of who he wants to get published. Of course, in 1936, he found really wide acclaimed success through Uncle Tom's Children, right? This is a story that plays off the Uncle Tom's Cabin, a very popular book, widely read by a lot of Americans at the time. And these stories, what he includes in them, are very graphic details of lynchings based in the South, right? Mississippi, like where he grew up. And most of them were based off stories that he had read about, or in some cases, those that he witnessed himself personally. With that being said, he ends up joining the Communist Party, right? He ends up being really good friends with the leader of the Communist Party. They're close acquaintances. They stay in touch for a long time. And then he finishes and publishes his memoir about his early childhood, which is called Black Boy. Again, this is the story of the book. I am not trying to offend anybody. That's just the story. Anyways, it's published under under his publication group, right, that he works for, and it immediately finds success, and it really is what continues to be his legacy going on. Of course, unfortunately for him, and maybe depending on who else, what others' beliefs are, communism falls out of favor, right, around the late 40s to 50s, right? There's this Red Scare, this witch hunt of sorts against the Communist Party and people who are claimed communists. So in similar to the Salem witch hunts, if you were accused of being communist, then the government started to freeze your assets, investigate you, and in some cases put you in jail for just for being part of the Communist Party, right? So having to face that and possibly lose everything he's worked for himself, he decides to leave the country, moves to France, and absolutely falls in love with the country. It's his home. He becomes a citizen of France, and is one of the famous expatriates of the time, right? So it's interesting to note that his legacy and his work, while he had several successes for his time and place and date, I should say, the thing that continues to be read and more widely discussed is the memoir, right, where it's an actual recounting of his early childhood, including things like gambling and drinking by the age of 6, right? Things that we would be appalled by, and that's part of why it's still read, right? Because it's such a vivid and detailed look at what life was like for a black person in the sharecropping household in Mississippi, right, the South. And so um, there'll also be a little snippet um, that I'll share with you all from an author called Ta-Nehisi Coates, and his book, which is called Between the World and Me, which is heavily influenced by the works of Richard Wright. And a thing to consider that I think ties him to Richard Wright very strongly is the fact that he decided to write this book when he experienced what life was like outside the U.S. on a trip to Paris with his wife, right? And when he saw how life could be, not to say that Europe is free of racism. In some ways, it's more ingrained in their culture and more accepted to be prejudiced. I should say. He still felt a level of freedom in just to be himself um, in France, and that's when he decided to write his his well, it's a nonfiction work, but it's pretty much a long letter to his son. Ta-Nehisi Coates is the one who's writing this, and it's heavily influenced by that trip to France that he can relate then to Richard Wright's life. But let's go ahead and get into it. So, and one morning, while in the woods, I stumbled upon it in a grassy clearing guarded by scaly oaks and elms, and the sooty details of the scene rose, thrusting themselves between the world and me. There was a design of white bones slumbering forgottenly upon a cushion of ashes. There was a charred stump of a sapling pointing a blunt finger accusingly at the sky. There were torn tree limbs, tiny veins of burnt leaves, and a scorched coil of greasy hemp. A vacant shoe, an empty tie, a ripped shirt, a lonely hat, and a pair of trousers stiff with black blood. And upon the trampled grass were buttons, dead matches, butt ends of cigars and cigarettes, peanut shells, a drained gin flask, and a whore's lipstick. Scattered traces of tar, restless arrays of feathers, and the lingering smell of gasoline. And through the morning air the sun poured yellow surprise into the eye sockets of the stony skull. And while I stood, my mind frozen with cold pity for the life that was gone, the ground gripped my feet and my heart was circled by icy walls of fear. The sun died in the sky, a night wind muttered in the grass and fumbled the leaves in the trees. The woods poured forth the hungry yelping of hounds. The darkness screamed with thirsty voices, and the witnesses rose and lived. The dry bones stirred, rattled, lifted, melting themselves into my bones. The gray ashes formed flesh, firm and black, entering into my flesh. The gin flask passed from mouth to mouth. Cigars and cigarettes glowed. The whore smeared lipstick red upon her lips, and 1,000 faces swirled around me, clamoring that my life be burned. And then they had me, stripped me, battering my teeth into my throat till I swallowed my own blood. My voice was drowned in the roars of their voices, and my black, wet body slipped and rolled in their hands as they bound me to the sapling, and my skin clung to the bubbling hot tar, falling from me in limp patches, and the down and quills of the white feathers sank into my raw flesh, and I moaned in agony. Then my blood was cooled mercifully, cooled by a baptism of gasoline. And in a red blaze I leaped into the sky as pain rose like water, boiling my limbs. Panting, begging, I clutched childlike, clutched to the hot sides of death. Now I am dry bones, and my face a stony skull, staring in yellow surprise at the sun. All right, so feel free to pause and replay that if there's still some things you want to um, pull from it, anything that you might want to continue our discussion. Unfortunately, only a few of you did post on the discussion board, and so I replied to those of you that did. But we're going to talk about some of those points that you did bring up. So one of the things that's confusing is the order of events, right? And um, it's hard to tell because we first come across this scene, right, of a murdered man, and then we get the experience of how it happens, right? Um, and so, one thing that was suggested is maybe this is the experience in reverse, right? Maybe he's reflecting upon his own death, as he's witness to the aftermath of his own death, and then he goes back to re-experience it, or perhaps the poem is playing out the events in reverse, you know. And while I think this is a fascinating point, and I absolutely agree that there is a reliving of the events. I think if they wanted us to believe specifically that this is a spirit reliving the events, then if it was in reverse, we would have it where the fire happens first, then the beating, and then the stripping and all that stuff. Where here, when we get into that, there's a rebirth of the event, and then it plays forward from the events how they happen. Right? He's beaten, or he's stripped, he's beaten, he's tarred, he's feathered, and then he's burned alive. Right? And so I think it would work more effectively if they wanted us to read this in reverse, if we had those actions in reverse as well. So then that leaves us with the parties involved. I'm going to skip the grotesque right now because that ties in with the violence. And so when we read this, we need to think about who are the parties involved. And there's three major parties, right? There's the person who is observing, also known as the speaker of the poem. This is a person that is kind of stumbled across the scene and is kind of witnessing the things as they happen, right? He finds all the buttons and the cigar butts, peanut shells, and gin flasks on the floor. And then there's the victim, right? There's the victim, the person that this happened to, which is different from the speaker, but they share a similarity or certain features which tie this event to them. So aside from the victim, we have another third party, which is the mass or the group of people who are witnessing the event, right? And the only traces we have of them, because as he says, the witnesses rose and lived, meaning he could imagine them standing there, and they all walked away with their lives, right? And so this group or mob, if you want to call them that, are the ones who are smoking cigarettes, eating peanuts, drinking, and having a good time with with women. That's where the horror comes into play, right? Whether it's literal or metaphoric, we don't really know, but we do know that it's pretty much a party, right? These are all things you find when you have a quote-unquote great party, right? If you have a great party at your house, you're gonna find empty bottles, you're gonna have a little bit of a mess, right? Food and plates kind of like left behind because people are just having a good time. They're eating, drinking. Sometimes you'll find cigars or cigarette butts all over your backyard, things like that. But that's because it's a party, right? People are going to indulge in the things that they enjoy, and so that's what makes this third party so sinister, is the fact that they are here to witness the murder of a man, and they're enjoying it. They're having a good time. They're eating snacks. They're drinking, engaging in conversation, right? They're yelling for his death. So of course this is a mob more than just a general audience. And so so those are the three parties involved in this, right? Now, why are there scenes of grotesque involvement, right? Whether it's the bones melding into someone else's body, this idea of being fused to a dead man, and then the actual graphic descriptions of the violence as it happens, right? Well, let's think about our first party involved, right? The speaker. Who is he? Or well, there. That's one thing we can identify. Is it a he? A she? Is it undefined? What are some of the traits? Um, because he refers to himself as my wet black body slipped rolling in their hands, then we know this is a black person. The fact that the things that were left behind were a tie, a ripped shirt, a hat, and trousers, you know, stiff with black blood, then we can tell this is a man, right? This is a man as well. So this is a black man, probably because he's wearing a hat. Probably that means he's an adult man, right? Children generally didn't wear hats. It's not something that they bought for their kids. Um, but it was considered fashionable and expected for a man to wear a hat, right? And so we have an adult black male who is stumbling across this scene, and the victim, we can tell because it says the body themselves is wet and black, is also a black man, because the things we find that relate to the viewer, the observer, or the speaker, I should say, they all kind of tie into what he sees. That ties them together. They're both men, adults, and they're black. And this is um, why it seems like the things that are happening to him, when in actuality he's alive and he's healthy. But the thing that he suddenly realizes, right, this is why his the ground gripped his feet, meaning that he was stuck in place, he couldn't move, and then his heart was circled in icy walls of fear. This is the realization coming over him that this person that was murdered, or we can say lynched in this case, was a black man just like him. And had it been a circumstance where he found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time, then it could have very well have been him that was stripped, beaten, tarred, feathered, and then burned alive, right? And so there's a purpose for the author experiencing, or the speaker in this case, experiencing things. Uh, yes, he's realizing that this is something that can happen to him, but it's tying it into a universal experience. This is something that can happen to any black man in, during this time, right? And the reason we have the audience or the mob, that ties into the graphic scenes of violence, because he wants the rest of the world, people who are not involved, of course those people who are in the mob, they know what it's like, right? They're witnessing it happen, and in a sixth sense they are enjoying it. But he wants the rest of the US, I should say, at the time, to read it in graphic detail. Those who have never seen a lynching, he wants them to experience it in a visceral way, a way that is so vivid and disturbing that you can't help but to shudder and say, oh my God, how could they do this? How could they enjoy doing this? And that then puts pressure on people to really reconsider the act of lynching, right? Unfortunately, I mean, while Robert Wright lived a long life, I think he died in 2008. It's sad to think that even though he was writing about it, only I think maybe 2-3 weeks ago, um, Biden, you know, um, President Biden, he signed into federal law, making lynching a hate crime. And so this is something he's written in the 30s, maybe late 20s, and almost 100 years later, is it finally being turned into federal law? And the only thing that means is, well, murder itself has always been a crime. Now the United States themselves have the ability to prosecute anybody who performs a lynching, and it's also considered a hate crime, meaning that there's additional consequence, and years tacked on for that murder. Um, but this is 2022 again, and it's barely being addressed by our government. So these changes have happened, right? Lynching um, and even juries of white peers soon felt the pressure to um, not just side on someone's side because of race. Um, but I mean, it's still something that is blatantly obvious for those of you um, who aren't aware. People of color tend to face harsher sentences um, and longer duration of of imprisonment um, based on their color of their skin compared to those who are white and commit the same crimes, right? So yeah, I mean, he's bringing it to the forefront. He's making people aware of it, but there's still this lingering kind of like cultural hesitation um, to accept sort of equal punishment for equal crimes. Anyways, don't want to get too much more into that. If you have any other points that you want to discuss, maybe feel free to include them in the discussion board, and we can go ahead and continue the conversation there. All right. As always, feel free to disagree. There's no one right answer. As long as you can glean anything from literature, then make it about how you read it, and that's perfectly fine. So the last thing I want to end on is what needs to be done by this week. So by Saturday, I'm going to need you all to submit a rough draft of your personal narrative. So this should be a complete rough draft, meaning you should have your cover page, an introduction, 3 body paragraph minimum, and a conclusion. Then by Sunday, I'll complete those assignments, and I'll give you feedback on them, so that way you have all of next week, Monday through Friday, to complete your final draft, which will be due on the 23rd. Okay, so oops, I did not mean to move to the last slide. So again, that's going to be due on the 23rd of September before midnight, and then of course I'll grade them and have them back to you by the following week. The last thing I do want to discuss is, sorry, give me a second. Sorry about that. My cat was just going ham over here. Anyway, so that doesn't mean that that's all we're going to work on next week. Next week, we're actually going to move towards our next major assignment, which is a media analysis essay, right? So we're going to take a look at ethos, pathos, and logos, how they apply to commercial advertisements, and then we'll also talk about an extra credit opportunity related to that, right? So while you will be expected to turn in another essay, the extra credit opportunity will be a presentation that you can record and submit online, sort of like I do here, whether it's through YouTube or a PowerPoint. It has to have an audio component, meaning that we should be able to hear your voice and you should be able to talk through your main points. And then that extra credit opportunity will replace the essay grade completely, and then it'll give you an additional 20 points towards either 2 weekly assignments can be replaced, or you can add 20 points towards any other essay of your choosing. Okay, or even this one if you chose, right? So say you got 130 on your presentation. This is going to be out of 150 points. So say you got 130 points on this essay. You can choose to use that 20 points to make it a perfect 150, or you can go ahead and take those extra 20 points and apply them to, for example, if your personal narrative, say you didn't do as well, you got only 100 points out of the 150, you can then add 20 points to that to say bring it up to 120. Or if you're doing well on your essays but you've missed a couple weekly assignments, then you can replace 2 of your lowest grades, meaning either zeros become, you get the full 10 points for them, or if you have a 5 and a 4, or a 5 and a 7, and those you want to bring up, you can bring those up to a 10. That's going to be the extra credit opportunity, but we'll talk about that more during Tuesday's lecture as we get into the media analysis. Okay, so for any other questions, feel free to get a hold of me, reach out to me via message, email, or text message, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. All right, thank you guys. Have a great day.